Stalking.
Press talk.
Good morning. The Subcommittee on Capital Markets will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Reforming the Proxy Process to Safeguard Investor Interests. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. And I want to ask for a point of personal privilege from the ranking member to recognize one of our staff, one of the minority staff members, if that is okay with you, sir.
It would be objectionable to me if we didn't.
Well, I do want to take this point of personal privilege and recognize one of our really important staffers whose last day with the committee will be tomorrow after about 4.5 years. Bring him out here. Don't let him hide back there. Is he here? Okay, good. Franklin, I want to recognize Franklin Thornton. Franklin, stand up. All right, Franklin. Franklin has served the committee as a committee clerk in the 117th Congress and was extremely helpful and patient to our members on both sides of the aisle during much of our COVID-19 pandemic, when hearings and markups and doing everything online was very via WebEx was very difficult. So I want to thank him for facilitating those hearings and those markups, and I want to thank him for his service, and I think we all wish him the best on his next career in Denver. So Franklin, thank you for everything. And now we'll move on, and I recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Thank you all for joining us today. This hearing will examine policies that prioritize increased transparency, accountability, and economic analysis in shareholder voting decisions, while also addressing concerns with the outsized influence of proxy advisor firms. I am greatly concerned with the Biden administration's continued efforts to force non-material environmental, social, and political issues on Americans' companies and investors. Prioritizing these ideologically driven regulations drives up the costs and burdens of participating in the U.S. public markets. This, in turn, diminishes the appeal for private companies considering going public or remaining a public company. And fewer publicly traded companies means fewer investment opportunities for Main Street investors. These increased costs hinder the ability of American public companies to compete on a global scale, putting them at a disadvantage while China's economic influence continues to grow. What's even more concerning is that these policies end up burdening retail investors who rely on solid financial returns to save for retirement, purchase a home, or pay for their child's education. We must remember that the primary purpose of our public markets is to foster economic growth. Unfortunately, unrestricted shareholder activism is diverting attention and limited resources from core issues undermining the attractiveness of U.S. markets and discouraging companies from going public. The prioritization of shareholder proposals that deviate from the company's strategic direction or long-term goals has transformed boardrooms into partisan platforms where fringe political agendas overshadow sound financial management and business strategy. For our public markets to remain focused on long-term shareholder value, it is crucial to reform the proxy process, to reduce the financial burdens on small and mid-sized companies and minimize distractions for management. By ensuring that shareholders' proposals align with the company's interests and long-term goals, we will promote value creation for all shareholders. Today, we will also discuss the Biden administration's imposition of climate reporting and other requirements that place unnecessary burdens on companies, hindering their ability to grow and compete in a global economy. For example, the SEC's proposed 500-page climate disclosure rule would replace voluntary sustainability reports with mandatory disclosures, including detailed emissions data and climate risk management strategies. Congress has not granted the SEC the authority to create regulations that compel companies to disclose general information about ESG-related issues. In fact, Congress repeatedly expressed dissatisfaction with the current number and complexity of disclosures the SEC requires, and repeatedly urged the agency to simplify them rather than adding to their complexity. Piling on pages of complicated disclosures minimizes their usefulness to Main Street investors and impedes the ability of younger, smaller companies to compete against large incumbents. In light of these challenges, it is crucial that we address these issues with a focus on fostering economic growth, promoting sound financial regulations, and reducing unnecessary burdens on American businesses. I look very much forward to hearing from our esteemed panel of experts today as we delve deeper into the matters in order to safeguard the interests of Main Street investors. And at this point, the chair would now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, a gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
And I'd ask unanimous consent that if the ranking member of the full committee isn't here to give her 1 minute, that she can do it after one or all of the witnesses.
So ordered.
This month, we have a series of hearings designed to prevent shareholders from getting the information they want to decide whether to invest and make sure that those shareholders don't affect the behavior of the corporations they own. We prevent investors from making decisions based on any criteria not approved by the governors of Florida and Texas. By depriving them of information, and then this morning's hearing, prevent them from introducing resolutions, and this afternoon, prevent them from getting the advice they need to decide on how to vote on those resolutions. We are told that these considerations are fringe or immaterial, and there are those who say that it is material only if it's 5% of earnings per share. But the Republican witness correctly testified yesterday that what's material, it's what's important to investors. Now, there may be a few unusual investors. Yesterday I posited the idea of someone who only wants to invest in companies whose boardrooms are painted purple. Those folks do not need to be catered to. But where a material portion of the investment community finds something material, it's our job to get them the information and to allow them to affect the corporate behavior of the companies they own. There are at least two groups of investors. The first I call the Ebenezer Scrooge investors, interested only in earnings per share. But even they need information about global warming. They have to decide whether to invest in the Maldives Coconut Plantation Corporation. And they will get an SEC document that details the risk factors in terms of competition. Coconuts might be grown elsewhere. But if you're going to invest in the Maldives Plantation Corporation, you also need information about another risk factor, inundation, because the Maldives are only 4 feet above sea level. So even the Ebenezer Scrooge investment needs information about the effect on global warming and of global warming on earnings per share. Second, we've got the John Denver investors. This is hundreds of billions of dollars of investment capital that cares what the effect of their investment is on our environment. And if we don't provide them with the information they want, many of them will invest in European companies that do provide that information. And third, what I call the John Bolton investors, those who are concerned about the national security impacts of the investments they make. Now, today we're going to focus on the rules for introducing a resolution, and we have the Republican SEC raise that to you have to be an investor of $25,000 worth of shares for a period of 1 year. I might go along with that, but what I can't go along with is they prevent aggregation. Well, what would this mean in the context of running a political campaign? What if we said any contribution of under $2,000 cannot be accepted by a campaign? So if you can run your campaign with only $2,000 and up, fine. But if you have 100 donors who want to give you $20, that doesn't count. Shareholders who invest $1,000, $500 in a corporation, if there's a lot of them, should count just as much as one investor with $25,000 of investment. We're told that the SEC should, in effect, conspire, collude with corporate boards to keep out of the proxy statement resolutions on certain topics. And look at how these topics overlap. One topic is you shouldn't have something that doesn't relate to the company's business, and at least 5% of the business. The other says you shouldn't have a resolution that relates to ordinary business operations. So if it doesn't relate to the company's business, you can't propose it, and if it does relate to the company's business, you can't propose it. Thank God today's SEC is no longer issuing no action letters that, in effect, disempower all shareholders. We're told that this is about cost. It isn't. This hearing is being held for those who think these resolutions might win, and they don't want to give the shareholders a chance. I'll yield back.
Gentlemen, time's expired. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate having this hearing today. Last year, ESG shareholder proposals continued their upward trajectory as activist investors continued their assault on the returns of actual retail investors. At the center of this debate are the proxy advisory firms, who in many cases support policies that run counter to their own fiduciary responsibility to maximize returns for investors. Coupled with the recent politicization of the SEC, proxy advisory firms have seized immense power to shift policy, often using a one-size-fits-all framework to promote a liberal social and political agenda. The proxy process is broken. It no longer promotes long-term shareholder value and operates without transparency or accountability and ignores materiality. As the Biden administration continue to focus on implementing costly environmental, social, and political-based regulatory requirements, which have significant ramifications for U.S. public markets, Republicans will promote policies that protect retail investors, maximize returns, and increase financial security. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to take upon a personal privilege to acknowledge Franklin Thornton, who served our committee as clerk for the past 2 years, including during the difficult months during the pandemic. His patience and professionalism enabled the committee to conduct its business during that time. And for the past few months, he has been serving dutifully on our housing policy team, and I would like to wish him the best in his future endeavors.
I thank you. We did the same at the opening. We are all so grateful for Franklin, and we wish him the best as he moves on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today, Republicans are giving the term investor protection new meaning by pushing legislation that would protect investors from their own ideas. For a party that supposedly values free speech and free market capitalism, they are now trying to muzzle the ability of shareholders to bring forth proposals that can influence the direction of the companies they own. MAGA Republicans would prefer that shareholders only be able to vote on what corporate management wants, completely avoiding any sense of accountability or transparency when it comes to corporate board decision-making. This committee has real work to do when it comes to investor protection, and this paternalistic, disingenuous approach to shareholder rights is not it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and today we now welcome the testimony of Mr. Jonathan Berry. Mr. Berry is a managing partner of Boyden Gray, LLC. Tim Doyle. Mr. Doyle is a senior policy advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the founder of Doyle Strategies, LLC. Mr. Chris Netram. Mr. Netrum is the managing vice president of policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. Dr. Joshua White. Dr. White is an assistant professor of finance and the Brownlee Currey Jr. Dean's Faculty Fellow at Vanderbilt University's Owen Graduate School of Management. And Ms. Nell Minnow. Ms. Minnow is the Vice Chair of ValueEdge Advisors. We thank you all for your testimony here today, and we'll get started. Mr. Berry, you are first recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, and members of the committee. My name is Jonathan Berry, and I'm the managing partner of the law and policy strategy firm Boyden Gray. I was previously the acting assistant secretary for policy at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Trump administration. I also currently represent the National Center for Public Policy Research and other shareholder clients in litigation against the SEC regarding its shareholder proposal rule, 14A8. While my views on the subject of today's hearing are informed by that work, I do not appear here today on behalf of any client, and the views I present are my own. Politically motivated shareholder proposals are a main entry point by which ESG-focused activists and money managers and advisors influence public companies to adopt their agendas. This process starts with 14A8. Now, the SEC did not invent the shareholder proposal. To the contrary, prior to 14A8, there existed and still exists a robust system of state corporate law governing proposals. While Exchange Act Section 14A gave the Commission authority to compel disclosures of existing information, Congress left the substantive regulation of stockholder meetings to state law, as was traditional. Rule 14A8 upended this arrangement, first by compelling companies to include shareholder proposals, and over time by contorting the law governing the substance of shareholder proposals in ways far beyond state law. For a time, the SEC permitted the exclusion of social proposals if they also related to the company's ordinary business operations. But in 1998, the Commission narrowed the ordinary business exclusion to prevent excluding proposals that, quote, focus on sufficiently significant social policy issues, unquote. The SEC opened the gates even wider in 2021 with a staff bulletin effectively cutting ties between social proposals and ordinary business completely. Environmental and social proposals now represent a majority of all proposals in Russell 3000 companies, 58% of proposals in 22. While so-called anti-ESG proposals have risen somewhat, the SEC has blocked many of them from consideration on company proxy statements. This last proxy season, my client, the National Center, took a shareholder proposal that the SEC had blessed on a discrimination issue and substituted the terms viewpoint and ideology for the prior proposal's terms sexual orientation and gender identity. But the SEC said that my client's proposal could be struck off the ballot, that viewpoint discrimination in the workplace was not a significant social policy question. The SEC's pattern of disfavoring conservative proposals is the only rational explanation for the disparity here. And we see the pattern. A recent analysis found the SEC granted no action relief on 46% of all requests for liberal-aligned proposals, but 72% of all conservative-aligned ones. Put the SEC's viewpoint filter on top of the enormous volume of pro-ESG proposals that activists put out, and you see why pro-ESG viewpoints are overrepresented in the proxy process. Now, once proposals make it to the shareholder ballot, the rest of the proxy process takes over to use the proposal as an opportunity to pressure companies to adopt ESG goals. Here I want to call attention to the proxy advisory firms in particular. ISS and Glass Lewis control upward of 90% of the relevant market. And for example, ISS recommends voting against directors of many companies flagged by climate activists unless the company has issued detailed disclosures of its climate-related risks and implemented net zero by 2050 reduction targets. Both advisors threaten, in their voting guidelines, directors at companies that fail to respond to proposals that receive broad shareholder support. And Glass Lewis guidelines seem to say that even 20% counts as broad support. I'd like to close by applauding the committee for grasping the fundamental nature of the problems caused by Rule 14A8 and supporting the exclusion of shareholder proposals if the subject matter is environmental, social, or political, and ultimately barring 14A8 altogether. I commend the committee's focus on ensuring proxy advisors and asset managers face greater accountability for how they recommend and vote on shareholder proposals. And I'd also like to note there's increasing activity in the states on these subjects. I thank the committee again.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. I now recognize Mr. Doyle. You're recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Good morning, Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, Chair Waters, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Tim Doyle, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center, or BPC, where I provide subject matter expertise on corporate governance and ESG-related matters. BPC is a nonprofit organization founded in 2007 by 4 former Senate Majority Leaders, Senate Majority Leaders Howard Baker, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, and George Mitchell. BPC drives principled and politically viable policy solutions through analysis, negotiation, and by providing a forum for diverse views. BPC's funding reflects the character and diversity of the organization in that it comes from charitable philanthropies, individuals, and corporate donors. As such, we believe all donors have unique and diverse interests. However, we believe that bipartisanship is the only way to forge sustainable public policy solution. It is with that philosophy that I testify today. BPC has been evaluating and discussing ESG-related issues for a number of years now. We have learned the key to understanding ESG is looking to how one intends to use the ESG data. As a result, the use of the ESG acronym varies widely depending on sector, company, and an individual's perspective. Given the difficulty in fully understanding the breadth of ESG-related topics, the committee should continue to work collaboratively with nonprofits, think tanks, academics, and of course investors and issuers in finding common language when using the term ESG. The ESG debate raises profound questions about the way to deliver returns for investors. The next few years will determine what comprises ESG in the future, or even whether the term has lasting power. Furthermore, given the exponential growth in ESG investment funds and other financially based uses of the term ESG, establishing some consensus around the definition of ESG would greatly improve the capital markets, further protect retail investors, and ultimately encourage more companies to go public. Of course, at the center of the ESG debate is disclosure. Determining what is disclosed involves numerous factors depending on if it is legislatively mandated, regulatorily required, or individually requested at annual shareholder meetings. My written testimony focuses on the regulatory requirement disclosure, which historically is used in materiality analysis. Also regarding the need for enhanced oversight of the proxy advisors, given the influence that their voting recommendations have on ESG-related issues. Materiality has been a standard used for determining disclosure at least since the 1976 Supreme Court case TSC Industries. What many don't realize is leading up to the holding in that case was years of litigation involving disclosure. The, quote, reasonable investor standard described in that case was itself a compromise in that it provided analysis to be used so investors would receive enough information to make informed investment decisions, but not so much as to become overwhelmed with an avalanche of data, as the court stated. This standard has stood the test of time, and this committee should strongly consider codifying that decision, if for no other reason to bring some regulatory certainty and disclosure for both investors and issuers. The growth of proxy advisory industry is in some ways an example of a success story. The transition from defined benefit to defined contribution retirement plans resulted in the exponential growth of institutional investors over the last couple of decades. This in turn has created the potential need to vote on thousands of shareholder proposals. It is ultimate, however, that proxy advisors began to have, and some have called, an oversized influence on the proxy process. Ultimately, an indirect, and in some cases a direct, influence over corporate disclosure and policy. We sometimes forget that the proxy advisors are for-profit entities, and inherent in that is a conflict between their recommendations and their clients. Moreover, one proxy firm in particular even started providing consulting services to the same companies that they were providing recommendations for. In both scenarios, the appearance of impropriety requires enhanced transparency and accountability to protect investors and ensure a strong capital market. Another issue that is regularly raised is that some proxy advisor reports used to make recommendations have errors in them that may well affect voting results on certain proposals. This committee should develop policies that ensure transparency to alleviate the conflicts of interest, to protect investors, and create a framework for issuers to correct errors before proposals are voted on. It is important to mention that many of these issues have had bipartisan support. For example, proxy reform, which has been contemplated by the SEC for more than a decade, has previously had congressional support. There have also been several Republican and Democratic-appointed commissioners on the SEC that have supported reforming the proxy process, including additional oversight of proxy advisory firms. In closing, I truly appreciate the opportunity to share some of what we have learned over the last few years at BPC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Netram, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Good morning, Chair Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, Chair Waters, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Chris Netram, and I'm the Managing Vice President of Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the NAM's 14,000 members and the 13 million men and women who make things in America. Manufacturing supports local communities across the country, creating well-paying jobs for Americans from all walks of life. Manufacturing pioneers groundbreaking technologies and life-saving innovations. And manufacturing is an economic driver that powers growth here at home and supports American competitiveness on the world stage. Manufacturing is capital intensive, and manufacturers often turn to the public markets to finance investments that create jobs and strengthen communities. The public market allows businesses to access capital, and it lets Americans share in the industry's success. Investments like mutual funds and pension plans help workers save for a child's education, a new home, or a secure retirement. Manufacturers have a fiduciary duty to act in these Main Street investors' financial best interest. Focusing on financial returns helps businesses grow and safeguards investors' retirement security. But in recent years, third parties have hijacked the proxy process to distract companies from this duty. Activists use the proxy ballot to advance political and social agendas. Proxy firms dictate corporate governance decisions, and the SEC is empowering these groups while also proposing ESG disclosure mandates of its own. As you've already heard, ESG proposals are at an all-time high. They now make up approximately 60% of all proposals, and it takes only $2,000 to get an idea on a ballot. The SEC is encouraging these proposals, telling companies that anything with broad societal impact can't be excluded from the proxy ballot, even if totally unrelated to a business's operations. Turning the proxy ballot into a debate club diverts time and resources away from shareholder value creation and forces companies to wade into controversial topics over which they have no control. Congress must prevent the SEC from empowering activists and forcing companies to include irrelevant proposals on their ballots. Cheerleading for activists are proxy advisory firms, but proxy firms' influence goes well beyond ESG proposals. Their policies shape corporate decisions, and their recommendations dictate shareholder votes. Despite their power, proxy firms operate with minimal regulatory oversight, and the SEC has in fact rescinded the modest protections that were adopted in 2020 to inform and protect investors. This means that the firm's conflicts of interest, errors, and lack of transparency go largely unchecked. Nevertheless, asset managers continue to rely on their services, in many instances even allowing proxy firms to robo-vote on their behalf. In other words, unaccountable, error-prone firms are robo-voting on decisions that affect Americans' retirement savings. Now, I want to take this opportunity to thank Congressman Stahl for his years of leadership on legislation to rein in proxy firms. Manufacturers believe that Congress must act to require the firms to engage with businesses, protect investors from conflicts of interest, enforce anti-fraud standards, and limit robo-voting. Now, not only is the SEC empowering proxy firms and ESG activists, the agency is also undertaking an ESG agenda of its own. New ESG disclosure mandates threaten to increase costs and liability for manufacturers and overwhelm investors with immaterial information. Even small and privately held businesses will feel these effects. That's because many of these new requirements impact supply chains, like the Climate Rules Scope 3 mandate. Investors need material information to make informed investing decisions and grow their retirement savings. Instead, the SEC has proposed far-reaching mandates that won't inform investors, but will harm manufacturers. Congress must limit the SEC's regulatory onslaught and require the agency to focus only on material disclosures. In conclusion, manufacturers believe strongly in the importance of tackling climate change, improving sustainability, and enhancing diversity. Taking a company-specific approach to these issues can support business growth and drive shareholder returns. But politically motivated activists are pursuing inflexible ESG agendas with little regard to their impact on everyday Americans' financial security, and the SEC is increasingly a partner in that effort. If this trend is allowed to continue, small manufacturers will be the hardest hit. I've spoken to small manufacturers around the country who are deeply concerned about potentially losing public company customers or facing insurmountable regulatory costs because they just can't keep up with ESG. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Netrum. Dr. White, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
Thank you. Chairwoman Wagner, Ranking Member Sherman, Chair Waters, and members of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, thank you for inviting me today to discuss reforms on the proxy process. I look forward to your questions on this important issue. The House Financial Services Committee is considering several legislative proposals aimed at safeguarding investor interests. These issues are paramount for ordinary investors who put their money into public equities to save for college or retirement. In my written testimony, I discuss what I believe are 3 key challenges running counter to the interests of most investors. First is a dramatic upswing in the volume of non-governance ESG shareholder proposals. Second is the influence of proxy advisory firms on managers and institutional investor behavior. Third is costly SEC mandates to disclose non-material public information that reduces the attractiveness of U.S. capital markets. I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record. The proxy voting process plays a pivotal role in corporate governance. It is how most shareholders vote for directors who have a fiduciary duty to represent their interests. Equity investors also vote on other matters, such as advisory votes on any shareholder proposals that appear on the proxy. In the past 2 years, we have seen a record number of environmental and social proposals, which are the E and S component of ESG, with the G representing governance. Managers can ask the SEC to exclude shareholder proposals from the proxy, which is known as no-action relief. Research shows that the stock price tends to increase when the SEC approves such exclusions. This suggests that managers are skilled at spotting proposals that risk investor welfare and only serve to advance special interests. In November 2021, the SEC updated its exclusion policy with Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which notes the SEC will no longer honor prior omission policies if a proposal has significant social policy implications. In my written testimony, I provide data analysis showing the profound influence that this bulletin had on proxy voting. In 2022, there was a 100% surge in environmental and social proposals, yet investor support for these proposals plummeted. In July of 2022, the SEC proposed additional changes to the rule underlying proposal exclusions. If adopted, it will make it even more challenging for managers to omit proposals they perceive as harmful to shareholder value. The cost of shareholder proposals is substantial and includes both the legal costs and, more importantly, the time that managers and directors spend addressing proposals. Flooding the proxy with environmental and social proposals likely overwhelms investors, potentially leading to less informed voting on critical issues. Institutional investors often rely on proxy advisory firms, which provide fee-based voting recommendations to its clients. Their reports can help passive portfolio managers reduce the cost of voting on thousands of proxies. However, there are concerns about the power of proxy advisors in the US, as there are only 2 firms that dominate the market. Studies show that their voting advice is highly influential, but concerns arise with this influence. Some show that certain institutional investors managing trillions of dollars follow their advice more than 95% of the time. This is known as robo-voting, which poses multiple issues. Research indicates that asset managers who rely less on proxy advice yield higher returns for their investors. That implies that robo-voting can negatively impact the majority of investors. One study finds that the largest proxy advisor often skews its environmental and social recommendations due to pressure from sponsors of those proposals, who know that those proxy advisors will bring in robo-voting. Managers and directors might also proactively adopt environmental and social proposals that destroy value to avoid negative attention or negative recommendations from proxy advisors on their own board seats. Finally, I'm concerned about some of the SEC's recent rulemaking. These endeavors mandate the disclosure of non-material information. Shifting away from the materiality standard for disclosure can harm investors and can harm the company by revealing proprietary disclosure costs. When the benefits do not outweigh the cost of disclosure, it should not be mandated. Together, these three forces place pressure on public companies and discourage private companies from going public. The end result is lower return for shareholders, fewer investment or diversification opportunities for retail investors that lack access to investing in public companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. Ms. Minnow, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral remarks.
There we go. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to speak to you. I want to associate myself with the opening remarks made by Representative Sherman and Representative Waters and thank them very much for the roundtable they presided over yesterday and recommend that everyone on the committee and the staff take a look at that. You know, many years ago, I was talking to a corporate director who was very unhappy with the vote on a shareholder proposal. And he said, you have to understand, Nell, those are fringe shareholders. And I said, you know, the vote got a 60% vote in favor. That means you're the fringe. We've talked a little bit about what the what is material, and I will tell you, as Representative Sherman said yesterday, the best people to decide what information is material are the investors. So as much as I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today, I particularly appreciate the opportunity to remind some of the members of this panel, including the National Association of Manufacturers, of how capitalism works. Because capitalism is named for the providers of capital. It is for the shareholders. And as I guess the only person on this panel who has actually filed a shareholder proposal, I can tell you that we've talked a lot about the costs, which I have to say are grossly overestimated by self-reported figures, but not about the benefits. I think it is of tremendous benefit. Do you think that the National Association of Manufacturers would be talking about their recognition of the importance of sustainability if they hadn't heard from their shareholders? I don't think they would. So I've got a few key points. Only a small percentage of companies receive any shareholder proposals. The household name companies get a lot, and many companies get 1 or 2, but the vast majority get none. The average is 1 every 7 years. So it's really not a huge problem. Even 100% vote in favor of a shareholder proposal is not binding. Companies are free to ignore it. It's a wonderful way, a very cost-effective way on both sides for shareholders to raise issues of importance. You know, a lot of these resolutions have been characterized as political. Again, as with material, it's up to the investors to decide what is political and what is material. So if the vote is non-binding, the cost is really very minimal. Limiting shareholder proposals is killing the messenger, one of the very few ways insulated insiders get honest feedback. Now, I've heard a lot of complaints that a small number of individuals are responsible for a large percentage of shareholder proposals, and that is true. But the important figure is the level of support that those proposals get. For example, 20% of the proposals filed by John Chevedden and Ken Steiner received support of more than 50% of shareholders, including a 79% vote at Duke Energy on a proposal that would require a simple majority vote rather than a supermajority for certain matters, a 98% vote at Carlyle, and a 99% vote at American Airlines. So again, these are not fringe shareholders, these are not fringe issues, these are issues of vital importance to a wide and diverse variety of investors, of individuals, of index funds, of pension funds, of all kinds of different funds. So I think that, again, that is how capitalism works. I also want to point out that shareholders are a very modest way to raise concerns at low cost to investors and issuers. If shareholder proposals are limited further, the result will be challenges that are far more expensive and disruptive for everybody. I do want to make, if I may, Madam Chair, a small correction to one of your points, which is that if a company goes private, it makes it not available for investment. In fact, the people I work with, the large pension funds, are huge investors in private equity. And I welcome anyone in the National Association of Manufacturers to go private at a fair price and see how they like dealing with private equity owners. I guarantee you the first thing that'll happen is they'll cut all the salaries. Proxy advisor services are the exemplars of the free market. Nobody has to use their services. There is competition. There is a new anti-ESG proxy advisor that no one has mentioned, run as a side hustle by presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, already being used by one of the large pension funds. There are no barriers to entry. Nobody has to buy it. And if 90% follow the recommendations, that's because 90% of the recommendations are vote for the board of directors, vote for the auditors. When it comes to the other issues, the more controversial issues, in fact, they depart from proxy advisors quite often. Thank you very much, and I will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Minow. We'll now turn to member questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questioning. Dr. White, for more than 80 years, shareholders' engagement has been focused on a company's strategic direction, or perhaps their long-term goals would be a better way of putting it, with an eye on maximizing revenue and increased returns for investors. Recently, there has been an increase in the number of shareholder proposals that have turned boardrooms into partisan battlegrounds, fighting over social agendas instead of focusing on sound financial management and business strategy. Could you please provide insights into the recent trends of politically motivated shareholder proposals, specifically how this shift has changed the focus of corporate boards away from investors and company strength and onto external agendas untethered from the organization's financial health?
Thank you, Chairwoman Wagner, for that question. Yeah, I would agree that there's been a politicization in the corporate boardroom. Companies now have to misallocate what are scarce resources that investors provide them in hopes of generating a return. And they are focused not necessarily on the G component of ESG, but more on the environmental and social component. As Ms. Minnow pointed out, oftentimes there are shareholder proposals to remove managerial entrenchment mechanisms such as a supermajority vote. Just want to remind everyone that's the G component of ESG, which academic research has shown for more than 20 years is valuable. The environmental and social concerns are that if you have a shareholder or a subset of shareholders or a minority shareholder that wants to push a special interest, they may be willing to sacrifice investment returns if it forwards their mission objective. That does not benefit all investors. In fact, if businesses do not run their organizations in the most efficient way, their competition will, and we compete on a global basis. So to the extent that we politicize the boardroom, then these burdens are just going to be passed on to public companies, and they may actually go private. That is what the research shows.
Agree, Mr. Netrum. In November 2021, the SEC issued new guidance that made it difficult for companies to exclude ESG shareholder proposals. Staff Legal Bulletin 14L states that the SEC will now focus on the social policy significance of issues raised by shareholder proposals, rather than an individual company's connection to a particular issue. How significant of a departure is this from the SEC's long-standing criteria that relied on a proposal having a connection to the company's ordinary business operations?
It is incredibly significant. As you pointed out, this is a huge shift in the approach to these topics. What we've actually seen in practice is that granted requests for no action relief post this rulemaking have fallen by about half. And what that means is that companies are now forced to deal with issues that are well outside of their control instead of being able to focus on things that are material to their underlying business.
So the impact is large, both on businesses and on the shareholders and the retail investor at the end of the day.
That is correct.
Mr. Netrum, it has been observed in the past that proxy firms ISS and Glass Lewis have released voting recommendations based on inaccurate and flawed data. I got incredible numbers yesterday. Somewhere around 42% of those are saying that this information is completely flawed and inaccurate. Investors who rely on the firm's recommendations are at risk of making uninformed decisions, undermining the integrity of the market. In this context, can companies review proxy firm recommendations and provide feedback to ensure that shareholders can make well-informed decisions when voting?
Currently, no. No such process exists for companies to make sure that the data that runs into the vote recommendations are accurate.
So why is it crucial for businesses to have the opportunity to review and offer feedback on draft proxy firm recommendations?
Well, because what we're talking about are effectively governance decisions on the direction of a business on which Main Street investors are relying for their retirement security. If those decisions are based on incomplete, inaccurate, or misleading data, well, the end result cannot be good.
And upwards of 42% is a very large amount. Would requiring proxy advisor firms to disclose their methodologies, calculations, and sources of information lead to a more transparent and reliable advisory process?
Absolutely.
Well, the chair now, I thank you, and I will yield back my time, and I recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, who is the ranking member of our full Financial Services Committee.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. First, I'd like Ms. Minow to know that you answered basically many of my questions about the value of shareholder proposals. And I'd like to just, have you comment further. As I mentioned, for a party that is supposedly pro-free market capitalism and pro-investor freedom, I find it incredibly ironic that Republicans want to limit the ability of the capitalists, shareholders, who are the owners of the companies that power our economy, from proposing initiatives to be voted on at corporate meetings. A key tenet of the Republican Party is that the government shouldn't be able to tell you what you can and can't do, but in the instances of our capital markets, they're trying to do just that. Republicans want to stifle the ordinary investor and their fiduciaries' ability to have a voice in how their investments are managed. Do you have any additional thoughts on that? If so, I'd like to hear them.
I appreciate that very much. There have been a lot of improvements over the years in boards of directors. When I first came to work in this field, O.J. Simpson was on 5 boards, and he was on an audit committee of one of them. Boards have become much more engaged, much more qualified. That is all because of shareholder initiatives. That is all because of shareholder proposals. It was not unusual in those early days for a person to serve on 10 boards. Now the average is 2 or 3. So board members are doing a vastly better job because of shareholder proposals. Management entrenchment devices. I'm not here to say anything good about CEO pay except to say it could be worse, and it would be worse without the oversight of shareholders. Again, I just want to emphasize that shareholder proposals are non-binding. Companies can and do ignore the results of a shareholder proposal. And if that means that shareholders vote against the board next year, well, that is how the market responds. But yeah, shareholder proposals have been enormously important. And I mentioned that 20 of John Chevedden's proposals got majority votes. I should also mention another 20 of them were successfully negotiated with the company in a matter that was satisfying to both sides.
Thank you. Ms. Minow, could you please discuss more how pension funds that hold public shares engage the companies they own and their ability to engage companies in which they are invested through private funds? As I understand, private funds don't make disclosures neither of their investing practices or policies, nor do they make available information about their underlying portfolio companies. How would pension funds that are large investors into private funds, such as private equity funds or venture capital funds, know whether the value of their investments are fair? How can they engage these private companies if they don't know about the governance or diversity metrics of these companies?
Yeah, thank you, Representative Waters. That is what private means. And it has been my experience in working with large institutional investors that they are in very close touch with the managers, the partners of the private equity funds, both in deciding whether to make the investment as they learn about what those strategies are, and also as they themselves engage with their portfolio holdings. So again, that is a very, very market-based look at things. You know, I have to say that I work with money managers. They are the most mathy people in the world. They are the most green eye shade, resolute, forward-looking people in the world. And the idea that of portraying them as sort of flower-strewing hippies who vote on behavior, you know, based on what their wishes are about flowers and bunnies is just not true.
So, you know, based on the knowledge that you have about the position that these pension funds are in, perhaps we need some legislation to deal with that. You agree?
I would love to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The ranking member yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizenga, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the panel. Welcome to the alternative universe. It's amazing. Yesterday, this side of the aisle was compared to Trotskyites. By the way, definition of that is socialist democracy. And by the way, Trotsky was trying to overthrow democratic capitalism, and he didn't think that Soviet Union was going far enough. So we also had a misquoting of Milton Friedman yesterday. This month is the 50th anniversary of his seminal work. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. It's literally the name of his essay. But we're being told by others on the other side of the aisle that we are somehow anti-capitalist, anti-democratic. It's insanity. It's complete insanity, and just underscores how political this has become. So I'm going to get to the Index Act, Mr. Netrum, first and foremost. Republicans in both the House and the Senate introduced the Index Act, which highlights the role some asset managers play in passive managed funds. You noted in your testimony that boards of directors must act in Main Street investors' long-term financial best interests, and those investors have the right to hold company leaders accountable via the proxy ballot. How important is it for these shareholders to have an active role in shareholder voting process? In other words, is it important that Congress create some guardrails on investment advisors who direct how shareholders should cast their votes?
It's critically important because these are not shares of the asset managers. These are shares held for the benefit of Main Street investors. They deserve to have a voice in that process.
Right. I want to move on to some of the other issues that we need to cover here. Proxy advisors like Glass Lewis and ISS, who is former president of one of those institutions, is here today. They affect the outcome of millions of shareholders' votes. Their influence is growing and, unfortunately, increasing focus heavily on ESG initiatives without any accountability, oversight, or competition. That is why they'll be appearing before my Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee this afternoon. Mr. Berry, your testimony pointed to overlap between the environmental and social agendas of prominent shareholder activists and proxy advisors. How do proxy advisors and shareholder activists arrive at these same priorities? Do they coordinate?
The short answer is yes. They work through organizations like Climate Action 100 that convenes asset managers, institutional investors, proxy advisors, and shareholder components.
And is it true that companies are already required by law to disclose, quote, impacts related to climate change that have a material effect on a company's business and operations?
Yes, absolutely, if material.
Materiality, materiality, materiality. All right, given that material information regarding climate change must already be disclosed, is there a good reason to deviate from that standard?
As was said previously, it's a time-tested standard, and there's no good reason as far as we can assess.
In ISS's written testimony, the firm states that ISS performs its work in a prudent, open, and honest manner. Yet in December of 2022, the head of governance solutions for ISS testified that ISS failed to consult with the Texas Employees Retirement System over new types of shareholder proposals. Mr. Berry, how does this failure like this and others affect the accuracy, reliability, and information provided to those actual shareholders?
It can have a huge effect. If there's no feedback, there's no consultation, how can you expect reliability?
Okay. Mr. Netrum, you emphasized in your testimony that proxy advisors have an outsized influence on corporate governance at manufacturers of all sizes, public and private. By the way, I know many privately held companies that have sustainability officers because their customers request it or they feel internally that they need to do that. How does this influence affect the decision-making process of companies and their boards?
Well, for the manufacturing industry, proxy advisory firms operate as sort of quasi-regulators. Their influence is felt well before any vote is cast as companies try to contort themselves to match their policies with what proxy advisory firms would recommend positively.
And it's true that while those proxies or those shareholder proposals may not be legally binding, ISS and Glass Lewis will then recommend that those boards that reject them get voted out, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, maybe not by legal act, but certainly by action. Okay. Real quickly, well, I guess I've got 7 seconds. I don't know that I'm going to be able to do this, but I hope that we can lend some common sense to this and that materiality is the watchword. And I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back. I now recognize a gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Capital Markets, for 5 minutes.
Capitalism is under attack. If by the sweat of your brow and the forbearance of consumption you accumulate capital and you have the courage to invest, these proposals would deprive you of the information that is material to millions and millions of investors. And if you do become a shareholder, the proposals here would prevent the shareholders from affecting the behavior of the company they own. The purpose here is to blind the investors when they make the investment decision and hog-tie them when they try to affect the company's behavior. Today's Republican Party has recently begun this war on capitalism. Without, as I said yesterday, they are of the same mind now with the centuries-long effort of the Socialist Workers' Party of Leon Trotsky. The gentleman from Michigan says that's unfair, and he's right, because it's unfair to Mao Zedong. Because it takes a Eurocentric view of communist thought and fails to give appropriate mention to East Asian communism. Imagine a shareholder resolution that says the company must de-risk from China, decouple from China, and not sell advanced technology to China. Many boards, probably most, would fight hard to block that from the proxy statement, and 2 political parties will help them do that, the Republican Party of the United States and the Communist Party of China. We're told we're supposed to protect retail investors, but we're told that if you have $25,000 to invest, you can propose something, but if 3 people have $10,000 to invest each, they can't. We must have aggregation. We shouldn't just be talking about ESG, ESG, W, and C. The last hearing that I chaired of this subcommittee focused on workforce as part of ESG. And as I've just mentioned, we need resolutions about how companies deal with China, and we need disclosures of the big China risk that so many companies take. Mr. Berry tells us we should rely on states. That's a race to the bottom. Which state needs a few $100 million or even a few $1 million in revenue? They'll allow boards to be entrenched management. I do agree with Mr. Berry that we should allow all flowers to bloom, both red flowers and blue flowers. A lot of people on my side of this issue are not CPAs. I guess I'm the only CPA on our side, and underestimate just how hard it's going to be to really have meaningful ESG disclosures, to ascertain, quantify, tabulate, define, make comparable, and audit numerical information is very difficult to devise that system. We're told that investors who care about ESG are the fringe, and as Ms. Minnow points out, they're the winners. Ms. Minow points out the importance of private companies, and we need to require disclosures by multi-billion-dollar companies, even if they're privately held, and not just to the private equity companies that invest. Mr. White puts forward the idea that if you want to be a John Denver investor rather than an Ebony Scrooge investor, you're morally wrong somehow, or you're incompetent. You should be blinded and hogtied, and frankly, I don't agree with that. We're told that we've got to prevent inaccurate speech. Everybody who wants to kill the First Amendment says that they're not going after good speech, they're only going after bad speech. The answer from bad to bad speech is good speech, and we shouldn't be censoring political talk, and we shouldn't be censoring what advisors have to say. Ms. Minnow, we're told somehow that there's a big cost involved in these things. I remember when creating the proxy statement was very difficult because you had to set the type. We didn't have computers back then. I was at the financial printing office. But I would assume that printing something is now easy. Tabulating is easy. Isn't most of the cost here the cost of trying to prevent by fighting this with lawyers and prevent the vote from ever being proposed?
Yes, that is true. As I said, the costs that they send out are very inflated. Shareholders are limited to 500 words. They can have as many words as they want to respond. They have in-house counsel to respond. In my opinion, it doesn't take more than an hour or two.
So they attack it at being fringe, and they say it's expensive, and the expense is the money they get to prevent these fringe proposals from winning.
Correct.
I yield back.
Gentleman, time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, very much. I thank all of our witnesses certainly as well. Proxy voting process is not working to serve the best interests of investors. I think that that's kind of clear when you have 97% of the proxy voting withheld within 2 organizations, which would be alarming to, I think, general investors who probably aren't aware of that and don't engage in proxy voting. As well, the idea that you happen to agree with a particular ideology from these proxy companies, and that's why you're favorable to them, can really head you down a road that, could reverse its course sometime in the future, particularly when laws, regulations, standard practices, laws that have been in effect since 1940, like the Investment Advisors Act of 1940, where there's fiduciary responsibilities, where there's ERISA, where it's very clear for pension funds and whatnot that you're to act in the interests of the investor, not an ideology. And if there is a conflict of interest, it should be disclosed. Little things like that have been followed for decades now. But instead, we have an SEC that has decided to put out a 500-page report that says how, we're going to do things a lot differently now, and because we believe in a certain ideology, we're going to force, not recommend, not suggest, not, even give tax incentive towards, we're going to force investment companies. And of course, we've seen pushback. I mean, Warren Buffett has called it asinine. I think that's a technical term. Large investment firms, I'll leave their names out, have stated that they're being asked, mandated, required, told to renege on their fiduciary responsibilities. So what are we talking about here, okay? If we want to see these sort of changes, they need to go through an actual legislative body on the federal government we call Congress, right? Not the whims of a few individuals who are temporarily going to be running a particular agency such as the SEC. So anyway, Dr. White, how does the politicization of business management and capital allocation influenced by proxy advisors, let's go back to proxy advisors, impact market confidence and investor trust? Do you think that this breeds trust, this sort of mannerism of voting?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So when you think of the word trust, you trust who you're investing your money with, your retirement income, that they're going to vote in your best interest as a shareholder. They have a fiduciary duty to do so. The reality is that asset managers can simply rely on the voting advice of proxy advisors whose interest might not be maximizing shareholder value. If I was rational, I would probably sort on only the votes that they recommend voting against for the board and only the proposals on the E&S side of governance that they recommend voting for. And that leaves out informed voting, and it's why we see asset managers who conduct their own research tend to outperform. So relying on proxy advice can erode that trust that your investment advisor is acting in your interest.
Thank you. Mr. Netram, don't you believe, and isn't it true that the information that is now being required by Chair Gensler's ESG disclosure proposals is material? If it's material to a public company's operations, wouldn't it already be obligated to be disclosed?
That's absolutely true. That is the core duty of a corporation here, to disclose material risk to their investors so that they can make informed investing decisions. That duty currently exists with or without this proposed rule.
Right. So, Mr. Netram, as well, you mentioned Representative Stile earlier and his bill. I don't know if you alluded to the bill. Would you comment on the importance of this legislation?
Absolutely. So Congressman Stiles' bill would make sure that proxy firm recommendations proxy firms are actually subject to some level of oversight. Right now, we're in a system where these are the only actors in the financial system that have minimal to no oversight at all. Everybody else, companies, exchanges, asset managers, are subject to fairly significant oversight. Proxy firms so far have been able to escape that, and the Stile bill would bring them into the net.
Excellent. Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. Ms. Minow, let me start with you. The shareholder process provides a very important mechanism for investors to express their views and is very essential to making sure that company executives are managing the company for the benefit of its owners. And that's what they're there for. However, I'm very concerned that the SEC's recent proposal to amend Rule 14A8 will create additional uncertainty and encourage the submission of proposals that by proponents whose interests are not aligned with those interests of shareholders who are seeking a return on their investments. For example, this situation. Last month, the SEC Commissioner Mark Uedag raised concerns about the process through which the agency staff decides whether to allow companies to exclude shareholders' proposal from their proxy statements. And Commissioner Uedag cited several figures that showed an 18% increase in the number of shareholder proposals submitted to companies between 2021 and 2023, and a 40% jump in the number of proposals that reached a vote over that same 2-year period. So, my first question to you, Ms. Minow, is first, do you agree with the SEC's Commissioner Uedag that we have seen an increase in shareholders' proposals over the past 2 years?
Thank you very much, Congressman. Yes, we have, but as I have noted, a lot of those proposals are withdrawn following successful negotiations with the company. And of course, we've had this new influx of anti-ESG proposals, most of which got single-digit numbers of support and cannot be resubmitted because the system works very well. That's how markets work.
And let me ask you this, would you attribute this increase in part to the updated November 2021 guidance issued by the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance about the application of Rule 14A8 in its decisions of whether to give no action relief to companies that seek to avoid shareholders' proposal being voted on?
My understanding is that that ruling is a return to earlier guidance. During the Trump administration, a lot of tightening of those rules occurred, and I think that the general feeling of the investor community is a preference for the earlier approach.
And in your experience, do you know of any shareholder proposal that led to a negative change or a deterioration of a company?
Thank you for that question. As I noted, even 100% vote in favor can be ignored by the company, and so that has not happened.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Digital Assets, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Appreciate this hearing. Glad to have our panel with us. Nell, it's nice to see you again. I saw on your resume how long you've been working on these issues, and I think I can beat you by 2 years, but we've known each other a long time, and you've been a real voice in the corporate governance arena. You know, with that said, I have to say I share, I don't know if I share David Scott's concerns or not, but I'll share his raising SEC Rule 14A8, and I'm not convinced that, as pro-offered, that we're going back quite to things that were before the Trump administration's changes. You know, we had a great hearing yesterday, and we just heard a lot of concerns about this. And in my view, between the staff legal bulletins, 14I and J and K, replacing with this 14L, it's a problem. I think it really politicizes the proxy process. And my friends on the other side of the aisle might be talking about, you know, great progressive ideas and things of that nature. And I don't think they should met with, you know, conservative responses. I mean, it's a law of physics here. A force of equal might will be met by another one opposing it. And that's not what the proxy process is for. And in addition to opening up to these social things, which is not relevant, it also it disconnects it from the individual company responsibility. And that's a big difference that usually doesn't get mentioned. So it makes it, as I say, much easier for politically motivated people to weigh into this situation. You take the wokest company on the planet, you pick it, Apple, Google, they reject every one of these social impact type statements. The management, the board recommends it because it's not relevant to the mission. And so I think we need to go back to the future and be focused more about who's on the board, are they competent, compensation committees, are they independent, are they implementing the strategy, are they developing a good quality return for shareholders, and get out of all this, this madness. So Mr. Netrum, let me start with you. Companies are facing more and more detailed ESG and political proposals that are intended to interfere or could be considered to be interfering with regular business operations. And then, as I say, 14L removes that, as I noted, that long-standing commitment directly to the individual business by the way it's phrased. So how does this proposal process change when the SEC limits no action release under 14A8, as Mr. Scott noted?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Well, effectively what it does is that it gives activists a roadmap to engage in real micromanagement of the company. As you noted, part of what we need to do here is to support companies taking risks and innovating and delivering returns to investors. And, you know, part of that is on the company itself. The company has a duty to respond to the marketplace. If a company isn't responding to the marketplace for the demands that they need, where the marketplace trusts them to act and build their business, that company will wither and die. So taking the activists and the roadmap out of it will allow companies to flourish.
Dr. White, when you look at these 14A8 proposals, it seems like it tips the scale to special interest proponents on either side of the political spectrum. Would this increase litigation risk for companies, and what other potential impacts might it have on corporate governance?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Congressman. It would certainly continue to tip the increase towards special interest groups. You know, when we saw with 14L, which is a staff opinion, not something that receives commentary like proposed rulemaking at the commission, we saw an increase in the SEC's disagreement for no action relief requests by more than 50%. And so we can expect that to continue with the new Rule 14A proposals that came out in July 2022. The SEC added language that says you cannot address, even if you address the same subject matter and the same objective, if it is addressed through a different means, it's not a reason for duplicative exclusion. So one could easily imagine 4 or 5 activists getting together and slightly tweaking the version of their proposal and having 5 proposals on the same topic appear on the proxy.
Yeah, I just think that goes against the whole, we have so many rules against not doing that with owning the stock, and yet we're going to try to manipulate the process through the proxy. It doesn't sound like a good idea. Nell, we've been around each other a long time on passively managed funds. Now, that was an innovation when we were in the business together. Now it dominates the market. Do you think that a passively managed ETF proxy should just default to vote with management as a fiduciary in that capacity, except maybe in the case of M&A?
No, I don't. As we said
Why?
before, the proxy advisors, over 90% of their recommendations.
Not the proxy
are for
advisors.
management. I understand that.
Respond to me off the dais. My time's expired. It's not about the proxy advisors. It's about what the manager's doing. Yield back.
Gentleman from Arkansas's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the opportunity. And again, I thank the ranking member, and of course, I especially thank the panel here today. You know, I seldom agree with my colleagues, but today I do. Welcome to the alternative universe. This is insanity, complete insanity. I agree with those statements. This was the headline that I read this morning when I got up and went to the Washington Post. Floods, fires, and deadly heat are the alarm bells of a planet on the brink, by an article by Sarah Kaplan. It reads, "The world is hotter than it's been in thousands of years. It's as if every alarm bell on the earth were ringing. The warnings are echoing throughout the drenched mountains of Vermont, where 2 months of rain fell in only 2 days. India and Japan were deluged by extreme flooding. They're shrilling from the scorching streets of Texas, Florida, Spain, and China, with a severe heat wave also building in Phoenix and the Southwest in the coming days. They're burbling up from the oceans where temperatures have surged to levels considered beyond extreme. And they're showing up in unprecedented, still burning wildfires in Canada that have sent plumes of dangerous smoke into the United States. Scientists say there's no question that this cacophony was caused by climate change, or that it will continue to intensify as the planet warms. Research shows that human greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from burning fossil fuels, have raised the Earth's temperature by 1.2 degrees. It goes on to explain. This is insanity. When we're trying to take away the rights of shareholders to know about these climate disasters, and we're doing it in the name of shareholder rights. I mean, this reminds me of the quote from Peter Arnett back in the Vietnam era, who said, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it." It's often misquoted as we had to kill them to save them. I mean, this is what we're trying to do to the shareholders here. I mean, this is exactly what we're attempting to do. This is insanity. Shareholders want to know about this. Investors want to know about this. Their long-term profitability. I mean, am I wrong about this? Is this fringe?
I thank you very much, Congressman. I appreciate that. And it allows me to mention that what we're seeing in these large institutional investors is a portfolio-wide approach. And that is That is, I think, a much better approach for sustainable long-term wealth creation than trying to do stock picking. You're 100% right. These issues that you're talking about affect every company in America. The information that we're asking for, it's no secret that it's the fossil fuel industry that is against these questions. Everybody else is for them. I haven't noticed anybody come up with a single example of some ESG proposal or ESG vote that was somehow detrimental to anybody. There's a lot of grand statements, but very few specifics.
I totally agree. I mean, it is fascinating that when I talk to people, this is their huge concern, especially in Phoenix right now when they're going to San Diego because they say, we can't take the heat. I mean, this is information that they want. They're investors.
Yeah.
Go
If I
ahead.
may make one more comment.
Sure.
I'm old enough to remember when I heard a lot of complaints about the short-termism of the large institutional investors. They only care about the next quarter. Now they are looking into the future. They are looking into the long term, and we're getting the same complaints from the same people. You can either have patient capital or silent capital. You cannot have both.
And it's interesting to me, again, when shareholders want this information, where they find it material, that now my good friends on the other side of the aisle say, you don't get to get this information. We're not going to allow it. I mean, I don't know how this free market, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, maybe I won't quote Trotsky or Mao Zedong, but it does seem to me that it goes against capitalism. I mean, it just seems to be going in the wrong way. I don't have much time here left, other than to, again, thank the panel for being here. I appreciate it. It's been very lively. But read the headlines. Talk to the people at home. Climate disaster is what is on their minds, especially during these heat waves, during the smoke coming from Canada we've never seen before. I don't know how the hell this isn't material. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas.
Thank you,
for
Madam
5
Chair.
minutes.
And before I focus on my questions, I would simply note I've just come from a Science Committee meeting, and I would suggest to my colleagues, both in Congress and around the country, one of the keys to addressing the future of this great planet and the issues that we address here from a business perspective is changing how we create our energy sources. Urging the bipartisan leadership, the bicameral leadership, the appropriations process to fully fund fusion research so that we can go to the next generation of energy production for this planet and the off-world. We've got to focus on that. But if we won't spend time and resources on the next source, well, that's our fate. Let me pull back closer to home. November of 2021, the SEC issued revised guidance aimed at broadening the scope and increasing the volume of shareholder proposals to be considered by public companies. Instead of focusing on how a social policy matter might impact the actual business, these proposals can now take aim at the wider aspects to society, unrelated to specific business issues. Mr. Netram, from your understanding, how does the SEC staff determine an issue has a broad social impact? Who gets to play God on that one?
That is an excellent question. It raises a number of questions, the guidance. What is the society that we're looking at? Is it the locality in which a company operates? Is it the entire United States? Is it the entire world? What is an impact? What is a measurable impact? Who is being impacted? And has Congress actually empowered the SEC to make those decisions?
Mr. Berry, could you also discuss this?
Certainly, there is a tremendous amount of viewpoint bias that the SEC staff exercises here. And they'll call one thing significant and another insignificant on pretty nakedly political grounds.
So in your observations, does there need to be any relationship to the operations of the company to get one of these classifications, these whatever you want to call it?
So really the upshot of what the SEC said in 14L is that there doesn't need to be any tie whatsoever.
Oh my goodness. Mr. Berry, in your written testimony, you provide historic context to how the SEC requires public companies to interact with shareholders. Could you expand on this historic perspective, specifically how the SEC arrived at the current treatment of shareholder proposals and how this position has changed over the past decades?
So The SEC originally focused its rulemaking on the core mandate of disclosure, what Congress directly authorized. But over the decades, the SEC has gotten more into the substance of corporate governance, something that the courts have disfavored, and yet we're still here. In the last few decades, the SEC has essentially opened the gates to all manner of shareholder proposals in the E&ES space.
Kind of following up on that, Mr. Doyle, also looking at the historic perspective, can you discuss how the proxy process has evolved from the, say, mid-1900s to where we are today?
The process itself?
Please.
Yes, I certainly can. As I think has been mentioned by a couple of the witnesses already, it is developed, I'm trying to come up with the right term here. It has developed, as was mentioned, it was first not talked about through the Security and Exchange Commission. And then, as mentioned, they started to provide rules for their involvement. And I will mention that the issue, that the more recent issue with proxy advisors is their inherent bias on both the recommendations that they make for clients that they have, as well as for those that they make have consulting services for. And I don't know if that answers a particular question.
Fair point. The SEC's aggressive rulemaking agenda is set to inundate investors with a flood of non-material information that public companies are required to disclose. Mr. Netram, could you speak to the challenges and compliance costs that public companies face and how they are preparing themselves for this? This is not free, right?
It's absolutely not free. That there is a dollar cost associated with responding to these proposals, but really for the larger cost and the bigger impact to the investors that companies are supposedly serving is the distraction from actually focused on the underlying business. Manufacturers are facing an increased challenge. We have supply chain constraints, workforce constraints, competition from China, raw material constraints. Taking time and attention away from that to respond to activists is really detrimental.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all our witnesses, and I want to thank you for coming here today and give you a little respite from financial services. We are all now going to travel to an episode of Shark Tank. Congratulations, you're all billionaires, and I am an entrepreneur with a great idea I'd like to pitch to you, but as a precondition of the pitch, I get to be CEO of the company we're going to build, and I do not have to listen to any of your nonsense as I deploy your capital or make hiring decisions. Are any of you interested in hearing my pitch? Are you interested in signing that term sheet?
No.
I would like to hear the pitch.
You are a weirdo. I frame it that way because it is blindly obvious to the average American how Shark Tank works, what the rules are, and I think we can get caught up in a lot of this language around shareholders, but let us remind my colleagues, as I did yesterday, of Milton Friedman's theory of shareholder primacy that says that corporate executives are employees of corporate owners and are accountable thereto. If you want to know what happens, if you can ignore the interests of shareholders, if you can get money and not have to be accountable to them, I would remind our colleagues of the hearing not that long ago with John Ray and the FTX bankruptcy. And let's ask Sequoia and Citadel what they thought about signing term sheets where they had no authority to impact how capital was spent. Milton Friedman is turning over in his grave, but I am sure that our nation's beleaguered C-suite executives are thanking the Republican Party for standing up for their fragile interests and needs. Mr. Netrum, do you believe that companies' climate risks are material information for investors to know? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, sir. Can you repeat the question?
Do you believe that the climate risks of a company represent material information that investors should know?
I think it depends on the underlying company and what the business risks that they faced are.
Okay, you mentioned, I think you used the word material 29 times in your testimony. Are you familiar with the definition of materiality that guides the SEC?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and just to remind everybody, I'll just read it here. It's from the Basic versus Levinson Supreme Court case. Information is material if there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important in making an investment or voting decision, or if it would have significantly altered the total mix of information available. A reasonable investor, not what certain members of Congress think a reasonable investor should do, because I know more than them what's reasonable. In 2016, the SEC issued a concept release requesting comment on existing disclosure agreements out of the Jobs Act. Do you know what percentage of investors commented on the voluntary reporting commented to say that the involuntary reporting was inadequate to meet the demand for climate-related information?
I do not.
You do know?
I do not.
Yeah, it was 90%. 90% of investors said voluntary reporting is insufficient. Do you know on the current proposed climate disclosures, do you know what percentage of investors have commented in support of climate disclosure in public companies' 10Ks?
I do not.
97%. This debate is settled. There is no question about whether climate disclosures are material unless you think that there are people on this committee who know better than free markets, who know better than the interests of investors. The SEC's mandate, I would remind everybody, is to maintain fair, orderly, and efficient capital markets and to facilitate the formation of capital. It is not to protect C-suite executives. We are here to protect capital markets. We are here to protect free markets. It may hurt my colleagues' opinion, it may hurt their feelings, to be compared to the socialists and communists of lore. And I have tremendous respect for the Bipartisan Center. I did not misquote Milton Friedman yesterday, but I am going to misquote Barry Goldwater today. Partisanship in defense of free markets is no vice. And I am sorry that it has become partisan to look out for the interests of investors, to look out for competitive markets, to make sure that we do not end up with a capital market full of FTXs where you get a bunch of dumb money where executives can do whatever they want. And I get it, there are people who would like that in this world. Our obligation in Congress is not to look out for them, and I need you all to be full-throated and join us and do that, because if we do not, this beautiful, wonderful economy we have is dead. I cannot believe we are having this conversation. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steil, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate you holding today's hearing. I think it's absolutely essential that we have this conversation, in particular when we see the massive concentration between ISS and Glass Lewis as it relates to proxy advisors in their advice, which is sometimes pretty suspect. Sometimes we see them get the facts wrong, sometimes even the name of the CEO they're getting wrong in some of their information. If I can start with you, Mr. Netrum. Is there a reason we shouldn't be able to see the analytical process that's playing out by these two proxy advisors who have a pretty clear duopoly on the advice?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure, they're providing information, but we don't have visibility into the methodologies that these proxy advisors are using. Should we have visibility into the methodologies that these two proxy advisors are using?
Absolutely. We need to have visibility into the methodologies, their sources of information, and their conflicts of interest.
I think that's essential. Do you agree, Mr. Doyle?
I do.
Mr. Berry?
Absolutely.
It seems like that it should be absolutely essential. It seems a bit of a no-brainer. And then we have Chairman Gensler striking down the original proxy advisor rule as drafted when Chairman Clayton was there. Do you know what the rationale thought would be behind that, Mr. Netrum?
I believe that the rationale was to reverse the Clayton era changes, thinking that they gave too much power to companies.
But really what we're doing is allowing ISS and Glass Lewis to be completely unaccountable. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
So it's really the net effect of Chairman Gensler's decision was to actually allow these two entities to be able to operate in the dark with no oversight from the federal government as they're providing advice, but we've seen them provide advice in conflict either with law or in the case of just simple errors without an ability for companies to be able to simply come back and counter the information that's being provided. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Doyle?
I do.
Mr. Berry?
Yes.
I mean, what's the impact, Mr. Berry, when you allow this duopoly to play out, when misinformation is being produced, or information that just simply needs to be countered because one of the proxy advisors views it in the best interest of a company for that company to engage in illegal behavior? For example, the Travelers case, where a proxy advisor recommended in favor of a shareholder proposal, which would have required Travelers, in that case, to engage in illegal behavior by altering the price of insurance based on race, which is outlawed in our states, rightfully so.
Yep. Inadequate oversight of the proxy advisors means they're going to be giving the store away to shareholder activists to drive all kinds of behavior, including stuff that can be illegal.
Mr. Netrum, do you agree with that?
I agree, yes.
And what's the solution to this then, Mr. Netrum? I have a bill, you've commented on it previously, that actually allows us to shine light, to have some disclosure, some understanding, some oversight over this duopoly. Do you think that's an appropriate approach?
I think legislation is desperately needed here to bring some transparency to this process.
What do you think the key aspects of that transparency should be?
I think there are two keys. First is disclosing conflicts of interest, disclosing methodologies, disclosing their sources of information so that investors can see exactly what's going on here. And then second, making sure that the anti-fraud standards actually apply to proxy advisory firms.
Making sure that what standards?
The anti-fraud standards.
Absolutely. There should be some accountability to ISS and Glass Lewis if they're engaged in providing advice that's either misleading, incorrect, or in the case of Travelers, illegal. Is that right?
That is correct.
Does the legislation that I've put forward accomplish that goal, in your opinion?
It absolutely does.
Mr. Berry, do you have further comment on that?
I think if we can cut down on the agency problems with the proxy advisors in the same way we care about agency between shareholders and owners and managers, that would be a huge improvement.
So we should disclose conflicts of interest?
Absolutely.
And do you see conflicts of interest in the two largest proxy advisor firms?
Yeah, especially between consulting and proxy advice, there's real issues there.
Mr. Doyle, I see you nodding your head. You agree with that?
I do, and I would also mention that this committee, members on this committee, and others have supported bipartisan through a bipartisan way to respond to and to try to alleviate some of those conflicts.
I think at a minimum we should have disclosure. I think it's abysmal that Chairman Gensler struck down the Clayton rule. I think it moves us away from further disclosure. It allows these two proxy advisors to operate in the dark. I think we actually need to have a more robust regime than was even the rule in place. I appreciate you being here, your testimony today. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Wisconsin yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank the ranking member and appreciate the good work of the panel. Ms. Minnow, prior to coming to Congress, I served as a union trustee on the Ironworkers Pension Fund, the Taft-Hartley Fund. I was a union trustee. And we would hire asset managers and obviously rely upon proxy vote services as well, advisors. And I have to say that as a union trustee, if a fund manager or an asset manager and proxy advisors ever voted against the interests of the ironworkers and the participants of that fund, they would be former fund managers, former asset managers, former advisors. So is there not, I mean, some are painting this as a system with no accountability and that it's a couple of activists that are directing the votes here. Is that really what's happening, or is there some level of, dare I say, democracy and causation between the views of the participants of these funds and the way the proxies are voted?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. It's been my great privilege to conduct training sessions for new trustees of union pension funds on proxy voting, and I have found them to be extremely interested in these issues for the protection of the plan participants. What do we all want? We want them to be able to retire in a comfortable way. And so you are 100% correct that the unions, pension funds, and the other pension funds that I've worked with are, the public pension funds primarily, are particularly focused on making sure that their asset managers make buy, hold, sell, vote, litigation, any decisions about share ownership purely for the benefit of plan participants. Furthermore, the federal government has not only the authority, but the obligation to act if they don't do it, and they have acted, not as often as they should, but they have acted in those cases. I want to mention that it is not union pension funds or any other institutional investor who has called for non-financial measures of corporate performance. It is the Business Roundtable, which announced that they wanted to go for stakeholders, and they wanted to have this very amorphous idea of, throw the dart at the wall and then draw the target around it. So, no, you're 100% correct.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a report by the Independent Shareholder Services entitled U.S. Shareholder Proposals Jump to a New Record in 2023.
So ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it's dated May 24th, so it's about 6 weeks old. But in the takeaway section, it says that the volume of shareholder proposals has indeed jumped 14% between January 1st through May 31st, 2023. But it says, interestingly, it says this increase is being driven by a new wave of anti-ESG sentiment fueling a record number of shareholder proposals. So this, you're right, there's a spike in proposals, but it's from anti-ESG people that are offering these shareholder proposals. And I have to admit, it looks a lot like democracy, right, Ms. Minnow? So you've got people that are arguing, protect, the earth from, climate change, and then you've got people that are saying we don't believe in that and don't invest along with those ideas. That's sort of the position we're in, right? So we represent, close to 800,000 people apiece, and if we don't listen to them, they will make changes in leadership. So isn't this a lot like democracy?
It is exactly like democracy, and as I noted, the anti-ESG proposals, most of them failed to get enough to pass the threshold to be reintroduced, so that shows that the market works, democracy works. One thing I love to tell members of Congress is that even one vote is enough to elect a corporate director, so if 99% of the shareholders vote against. So I will give you all shareholder proposals. I will get rid of shareholder proposals entirely if shareholders can vote out boards of directors. If you need 50% in order to serve on the board, then let the shareholders send the message that way. In the meantime, shareholder proposals are a very modest, low-cost way for them to raise the issues they care about.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts yields back, and the gentleman is from New York. Mr. Garbarino is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for holding this hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Berry, we're pleased to hear that those across the aisle are concerned with shareholder democracy. In the spirit of promoting shareholder democracy, would you agree that if a shareholder proposal is rejected time and time again by a majority of shareholders, that their voting preferences should be heard, that there should be a cooling-off period for it being resubmitted?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Netram, in the spirit of promoting shareholder democracy, should two proxy advisory firms be able to dictate 30% of proxy votes? Shouldn't the shareholders themselves be voting and not auto-voting the preferences of third parties?
I believe the shareholders themselves should be voting for their preferences.
Thank you. It has been suggested, Mr. Netram, that the cost of shareholder proposals is just an hour of work. Can you, at a high level, discuss the cost to companies?
Sure. The real cost of the companies lies on the time and attention that executives are diverting from the operation of the underlying business. In the manufacturing sector in particular, we're facing a set of challenges that are existential, and taking the executive's attention away from that and navigating these incredibly turbulent waters is not helpful to shareholder value creation.
So, just an hour of work that's not true. It's going to take a long time. What about retail investors? Is there a cost to them? Presumably, they have to read through the proposals to make informed decisions. Some companies have millions of retail investors. Is that time quantifiable?
It must be quantifiable. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm sure that it is.
Wouldn't making our markets more efficient and letting boards focus on sound financial policy rather than political platforms enhance capitalism?
I strongly agree with that statement.
Thank you. I want to ask you now about impacts to the changes to Bulletin 14L. Companies are facing more and more detailed environmental, social, and political proposals that are intended to interfere with regular business operations. One publication that has helped fuel this pattern is the SEC's Staff Legal Bulletin 14L, which made a number of changes that broaden the scope of what could be deemed eligible for a company's proxy statement. One of those changes is the altering of ordinary business exclusion, effectively removing the long-standing requirement that there be a connection between a proposal and the company. Mr. Netram, how does the shareholder proposal process change when the SEC limits the availability of no action relief under Rule 14A 8? Additionally, how can this change interact with the operations or business of a company?
It fundamentally alters the way in which a business is run. If you remove that nexus between the core operation of the business and the shareholder proposal to open that up to really anything under the sun, you really are taking the time and attention away from running your underlying business.
So, yeah, so you said you could open anything up under the sun, which means it could allow shareholders to influence more of the day-to-day operations of a company, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. So can you explain how the increased level of detail and specificity in shareholder proposals create governance risks by distorting the board decision-making process?
Absolutely. I think it goes beyond distorting the decision-making process to actually giving greater power to shareholder activists in that under the new regime, you're allowed to make minor alterations to a proposal, infinite versions of alterations to proposals, and have corporate management be forced to consider each of those in turn.
Is there any way to reform Rule 14A8 to combat the submission and resubmission of non-germane shareholder proposals?
Yes, I think we need to go back to actually ensuring that proposals that are germane to the underlying business are the focus.
Dr. White, the SEC's proposed amendments to Rule 14A8 would tip the scales in favor of a small group of like-minded shareholders whose objectives may not be aligned with the objectives of Main Street investors or the best interests of the company and shareholders. Can you discuss the SEC's proposed amendments?
Yeah,
and the potential impact they will have on the public markets?
Thank you for that question. So yes, there were 3 proposed amendments. One was the substantial implementation exclusion, and it says that if you have already substantially implemented the subject matter with the same objective and the same means, then you can exclude it. The new rules would require that you prove that in order to achieve that exclusion. The duplication exclusion, if there's duplicate proposals, I'd mentioned earlier, if you have 2 or 3 activist shareholders that want to achieve the same objective, they can propose 2 or 3 different means and it can appear on the proxy. And for example, Amazon had 18 shareholder proposals on its proxy this year. If these rules were to move forward, it would make it even harder to remove.
I ran out of time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me ask you, Ms. Minow, do proxy firms proactively push ESG-related information out to the investors, or is it customary for investors to ask for ESG-related information about a company as part of their established proxy voting policies?
Thank you for that question. There is a variety. The clients have different relationships with ISS, and you have some in each of those categories. But ISS, I was one of the co-founders of ISS, so I can tell you that ISS began because all of a sudden there were complicated issues on proxies. Before that, it was all very routine. Vote for the directors, vote for the auditor, go home. But all of a sudden, there were complex issues that had to do with CEO pay, that had to do with management entrenchment. And so when the proxy advisors began, they started addressing those issues. Some will go to ISS and say, here are our policies, please vote according to our policies. Some will say, we will look at your advice and we will evaluate it and decide what we agree with and what we don't agree with. And so different clients have different kinds of relationships with ISS.
So, would you say then it becomes, if ESG, is it, in asking these questions, is it unnecessary or irrelevant for an investor to ask for different kinds of information?
Absolutely, that is required by their obligation as fiduciaries. And just as they get information about buy-sell decisions, they are getting information about voting decisions and then acting on it according to their own policies.
So let me make sure that I'm correct. So would it be correct to say that proxy advisors are providing this information in response to a market-driven, investor-driven demand?
That is 100% correct. And as I pointed out earlier, presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy has now started an anti-ESG proxy advisory service, and anyone who wants to purchase that service can.
So when we look at our capital market systems, which I believe to be the envy of the world, everyone looks at it, this is the envy of the world, it seems that for it to work best, we would want our institutional investors to have access to independent analysis provided by proxy advisors or any other source of their choosing to enable them to make the most informed decisions possible. Agree?
100%.
So why in the world do you believe that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to stifle this access?
They want to kill the messenger, and that's the opposite of what capitalism and efficient market theory is about.
Kill the messenger. I don't understand that. I listened to my other colleagues when they were asking their questions. We are in some weird times here. What about, let me ask this, Ms. Minow. Shareholder proposals are helping to raise industry standards for the diversity of corporate boards and C-suites. Do you believe this is an effective way for shareholders to signal that they care about the diversity of a company's board or C-suite?
I really want to emphasize your use of the word signal because it is exactly appropriate. This is an area where shareholders are communicating. They are not forcing anybody to do anything. You know, it strikes me that we literally pay these executives the big bucks so that their knees don't get weak when someone criticizes them.
And so can you share examples from your work where shareholder proposals have led to positive changes or improvements within the companies?
Absolutely. They have led to boards being far more engaged and effective and qualified. They have led to the end of many entrenching devices that made companies less accountable. And they have led to, as I said before, I'm not saying anything good about CEO pay. I'm just going to say it would be a lot worse if it were not for shareholder input. So I think they've led to some very important changes and better disclosure, more accountability. And again, that's what markets are all about.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back, and the chair now recognizes yet another gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like many of my colleagues here today, I have serious concerns about the potential consequences of focusing on costly non-material environmental, social, and political issues at the expense of sound financial policies. What we're seeing in this press from both government regulation and shareholder activism, driving up the costs and burdens associated with participating in the United States public markets, and it detracts from companies being able to raise capital and foster economic growth. Instead of focusing on running their businesses, we see companies having to spend their time and resources addressing politically motivated proposals that don't have anything to do with the company's strategic direction or long-term goals. My home state of New York has been at the forefront of promoting ESG policies. Back in 2019, New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli released guidelines on how the Common Retirement Fund would begin to pursue ESG goals with a new climate action plan, for instance. We've seen the Common Retirement Fund repeatedly filing shareholder proposals and pressing public companies to adopt these policies. This is not just some random shareholder. This is an elected official using his perch to drive companies to make decisions. That is not democracy. Not even close. Over the past years, this fund alone has filed hundreds of proposals, and many companies have chosen just to settle and cut a deal, leading more reports and disclosures and diverted resources. Now, this is the same pension fund, by the way, that just announced a negative return of 4.1% for the state fiscal year that just ended. Bang up job. Doing real good by the taxpayers. Because, by the way, in New York, the taxpayers are on the hook when we don't meet our requirements. Several pension funds in New York City are actually even now facing lawsuits alleging that they have breached their fiduciary duty. Yeah, this is really working out great. Good policies. Now, we've seen a lot of examples recently, and I hear it from my constituents. People want corporations to leave politics at home and focus on the underlying purpose at hand of running their businesses, selling their products, and delivering a return for their investors. Stay the hell out of politics. Leave it to Congress. Leave it to state legislatures. There's plenty of politics around here at all times. The American people are so tired of politics consuming everything, from the media to corporate America to education. It's pathetic. And it is creating a challenge across the board. Mr. Berry, do you agree that politics and social policy should be made in Congress and state legislatures and not in corporate boardrooms?
This is what Congress and legislatures are for, Congressman.
I agree. Mr. Netram, shareholders who submit proposals, especially on environmental and social topics, often argue that these proposals serve the long-term economic interests of companies and shareholders. Could you respond to this claim?
I would say that the long-term economic interests of shareholders are best focused, are best served when companies focus on their underlying business itself.
So would you agree that if, for instance, the New York State Pension Fund is giving a negative return, that's probably not in the best interest of pension fund recipients?
Without knowing much about the New York City Pension Fund, those don't sound like great facts, sir.
Makes sense. Dr. White, can you speak about the prevalence and persistence of socially oriented shareholder activism and the influence of proxy advisory firms affect shareholder value and the ability of corporations to make efficient and effective business decisions?
Yeah, thank you. I've heard a lot of discussions today about it maybe taking 1 hour to respond to shareholders. I can tell you that's not, you would get a low grade in my class if you submitted that as a response. You have to carefully consider each proposal, potentially negotiate with the special interests, request relief from the SEC, which they reject more than 50% of that, or now and reply if they fail to provide relief. Amazon spent 116 pages and 40,000 words, which would take the average investor 2 hours to read. So I doubt it would take you 1 hour to respond if it takes you 2 hours to read, and it was very politicized.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Minnow, thank you and all of our witnesses for giving of your valuable time to be here with us. I think we sometimes take for granted those of you who come before us and spend a lot of time, and the check we give you is very very little, probably like zero. Thank you very much. Ms. Minnow, saying something is so does not make it so. And there are, and have been here today, suggestions that proxy advisors have their own political and social agenda. And many of those who have asserted that say that they have an outsized care about climate change, which I'm still struggling with since this is the only climate we have. What are your views on this? Do proxy advisors always recommend in favor of climate or social proposals?
Thank you for the question. And as Dr. White pointed out, there are a lot of shareholder proposals relating to climate which did not get substantial votes and which got votes lower this year than they did in previous years. So no, that is not true. You know, proxy advisory services, I will say again, no one has to buy it, and the people who do buy it are the most sophisticated, professional, financial experts in the world. And they have a choice of one that is a registered proxy advisor, one that is not, one that has conflicts of interest, one that is not, now a new one that is the anti-ESG. Maybe they'll get all three and compare what their recommendations are. Those are their own financial choices. So yeah, the evidence shows that, that the clients of the proxy advisors depart from the recommendations of the proxy advisors on any issue that is complex or controversial.
Do you agree, Mr. White?
I beg your pardon?
No, Mr. White, I was asking if he did.
No, I think that sounds like a fair description of the proxy proposal process. You know, proxy advisors do have conflicts of interest, some of them do not. I would be concerned, though, of such a concentration in two entities that have so much power. I think if we were describing any other setting where an entity influenced trillions of dollars of investment returns and they were not we did not have oversight or regulation or transparency, we would be highly concerned. So I'm not sure how proxy advisors are different.
Yeah, but neither of you are suggesting that that the proxy advisors are like puppet masters who have control over asset managers or institutions.
I compare them to restaurant critics. You know, you can read the review of a restaurant and decide, well, they don't like green peppers, but I do like green peppers. Maybe I will like it. And you know, these are First Amendment protected publications that are voluntarily purchased. And I would be very, very cautious about providing any kind of prior restraint or additional review.
Great example with the restaurants. I don't like green peppers either. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, to the ranking member. I appreciate it, and thank you very much for the panel being here today. I want to talk a little bit to our witnesses who are shedding light on this, I think, very important topic. People in my district, Iowa's 3rd, elected me to serve their best interests, not that of any political party or agenda or social agenda that's being set forward. To that end, I, along with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle today, support policies that prioritize protecting everyday families, farmers in my home district, small business owners, and Americans across the board. Their investment and their financial futures often depend on the decisions that are being made in this room. This follows up with yesterday's hearing on what we would like to drill down on for a term called robo-voting. This is an alarming and ramping process and that has come across the board. For those of you watching back in Iowa, robo-voting is the practice of automatically casting votes with proxy advisors' recommendations. Only 2 firms, including a member who is on this panel today, are part of a duopoly, if you will, who are casting 97% of the proxy advisor market. They've given unprecedented power and control over my constituents' 401ks and their future funding. Essentially, a corn grower who lives in my home state, their livelihood to both fuel and feed the world is being unknowingly funding to groups who are committed to demising their very line of existence. Their hard-earned 401k portfolio investment and advisors who are voting on their shares boast solely on the recommendations of these two firms that operate oftentimes in opposition to those very farmers, livestock producers, and biofuels that they have built their business upon. In fact, in some cases, they're openly hostile competitors and overseas companies where their retirement dollars are going. This can impede and even seek to end traditional farming in my state, and that's just one sector. In Iowa, growers, who also are investors, have little knowledge and only two respectable options to choose from in terms of proxy advisors. Not only are farmers losing funds to their competition, but they're losing market performance on those hard-earned retirement funds. According to Forbes, numerous studies demonstrate and correlate between an increase in activism in areas like environmental activism into public pension funds promoting social agendas and lower stock returns, resulting in a staggering 14% decrease in valuations for those affected companies. To that end, Madam Chair, I'm introducing a bill next week that requires the SEC to make a final rulemaking prohibiting the practice of robo-voting and prohibits institutional investors from outsourcing their voting decisions to a proxy advisor. It requires them to be based on investment merit returns versus activist desires. In my opinion, it is beyond time that this corrupt and largely lazy practice is brought into the light and ended. Our constituents are counting on us for this level of change. With that, Mr. Netrum, can you go into detail and describe to us the process of robo-voting and how it impacts the decision-making process and the fiduciary responsibilities of asset managers?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question, Congressman. So robo-voting, as you so accurately described it, is the process by which proxy firms automatically cast votes on asset managers' behalf in line with those proxy firms' recommendations and without any review by the asset managers. So what you have is a system in which asset managers don't have the ability to make an informed decision on the votes that they're taking because the proxy firms are just automatically casting those votes. By definition, that means that those asset managers may or may not be acting in the Main Street investors' best interest.
Why do you think then that Chair Gensler of the SEC did away with former Chair Clayton's overhaul of proxy advisor firms in 2020? And I would offer, do you think that a robo-voting bill like the one I'm proposing this morning is a priority?
On the second question, absolutely. Thank you for leading on that legislation, Congressman. I think it's absolutely needed and a real priority for the industry. On the first question about Chairman Gensler's actions here, it's hard to know his mind, but it certainly does seem to be part and parcel of the SEC's overall effort to deregulate and empower proxy advisory firms. The net effect of this is that your constituents, Iowans, are left with conflicted, error-ridden advice that is being automatically voted on their behalf without them even knowing about it.
Thank you, Mr. Needham. With that, Madam Chair, I yield my time.
Gentleman from Iowa yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Indiana, Mrs. Houchin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Wagner and Ranking Member Sherman, and thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony and for speaking with us today. One of my top priorities as a member of this committee is to protect retail investors and ensure that my constituents in Southern Indiana are given the same financial opportunities and the level of priority as investors in any other part of the country. When I hear from people back home, a constant point of concern is for the security of their wallets, the ability to save for retirement, provide for their families, and secure their futures. As my colleagues have discussed, the current system has lost sight of these priorities. Our capital markets and the soundness of our financial system have long been among our greatest strengths, but as political agendas and unrelated social issues drive the focus elsewhere, everyday Americans are forced to bear the cost of diminished returns and lost financial security. As a member of the ESG Working Group and this committee, I'm glad we're now turning our attention to this issue. There's no reason why the well-being of everyday investors should take a back seat to politics over other unrelated issues. Mr. Netrum, you submitted a comment letter to the SEC back on September 12, 2022, regarding their proposed amendments on Rule 14A-8. As you stated in your letter, these proposals, quote, will ultimately force companies and shareholders to consider proposals anytime an activist demands, irrespective of whether the company has already taken steps to address the underlying issue or whether shareholders have already considered and rejected or are currently considering a similar proposal. Needless to say, that's very concerning. As the current system works, activists can persistently resubmit similar proposals year after year, despite being previously rejected by a majority of the shareholders. By moving forward with this proposal, the SEC would place the interest of activists even higher than the well-being of their investors. Mr. Netrum, do you think it's fair for companies to have to continuously invest resources in fighting activist proposals that clearly do not benefit the company, its shareholders, especially when proposals have been rejected in previous years?
Absolutely not. When a broad majority of shareholders have rejected a proposal, it is absolutely unfair for companies to have to continually reassess and reengage with the activists on those ideas.
And are there ways that we can reform this process, the no action process, so that we can prevent these duplicative problems?
I think Congress has a real role to play here in reining in the SEC and directing them on a path that is more in line with the interest of Main Street investors.
That's certainly part of the reasons why we're here today, to really consider what package of bills we may be moving forward to address some of these issues. I'm pleased to be leading an initiative that will address the issue. My bill will nullify this burdensome and unnecessary SEC proposal from taking place, saving shareholders both time and money and ensuring that the interests of a small number of activists don't take priority over our everyday investors. Mr. Netrum, the SEC's required mandate includes protecting investors, facilitating capital formation, and promoting efficient markets. How does the dominance of social and policy issues in corporate annual meetings conflict with those objectives?
The SEC can fulfill its mission to protect investors and support capital formation by allowing companies to really focus on long-term value creation. That's where their focus needs to be. What the SEC has done instead is taken steps to ensure or really encourage activists to hijack the proxy ballot and divert time, resources, and attention from the underlying business in which Main Street is investing.
And I would argue that that in and of itself is a threat to the general bottom line and overall performance of those shares for their shareholders. I'm grateful to each of you for coming here to speak today. As we continue this important work on the committee, I hope we can ensure the well-being of investors remains the chief focus of our capital markets. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Indiana yields back. And seeing no other members on the dais to question, I'd just like to thank our witnesses today for their testimony. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their swift response. I ask our witnesses to please respond, as I said, as promptly as possible. This hearing stands adjourned.